if we go back to AMD A12, it's pretty nice design. 3 memory units here. It's pretty, it's wider actually than the Zen, and actually the first Zen, because first Zen has only 2 memory units. The second generation has a 1 extra store unit, so it's pretty smart actually. There was also expected probably the same 4 floating point units, and maybe probably also 2-way SMT if it's a sister core to Zen. It was planned to release 2017, the same like a Zen 1, and it will be probably the most powerful ARM server CPU on the world, but it was cancelled 2015, and Jim Color actually left AMD. And I think my opinion uh, before this analysis I did was that canceling the K12 as an ARM chip was a really good thing in terms of resources, and because ARM is weak architecture, whatever. But today, when I see the numbers, and the ARM is, let's say, the leading architecture and the best instruction set, I think right now that it was really big mistake, and it can cost AMD a lot of money actually. And because really interesting thing when I was digging into some data is that ARM architecture has a higher IPC just from being ARM architecture. It's the architecture is more efficient and delivers more performance per cycle just because the instruction set. Actually, I found out really interesting study, and you can actually read on the internet, but I will show you the, let's say, one of the picture which is resulting, and you can see here they did a really interesting study in terms of they did a mathematical model of Intel Haswell CPU. They also did the ARM Cortex A15, and also they did a mathematical model of the Alpha EV6. The Jim Color was working on it, I guess. So this is the Jim Color's EV6. This is the ARM, and this is the x86 CPU. And they actually modified, and they did a study, the simulation, how would Haswell x86 CPU perform if they would run ARM instruction set. So of course different front ends, and of course it's not super exact simulation, but it's giving really interesting comparison. You can see here this red line. This is the base. This is the baseline, which is the Haswell on x86. This is the Haswell x86 baseline. So you can see this blue slopes, actually this blue data is actually showing how faster is the Haswell using ARM instruction set. And you can see there is like a 20% here. It's like a mostly, it's really like 20%. Sometimes it's much more in the floating point. Sometimes it's losing the ARM, but in average, it's approximately 20% higher performance. It means IPC per than x86, guys. But x86 is not bad actually, because if we compare to the Alpha architecture doesn't gain much actually. It's losing a lot really often with the x86, and sometimes it's losing a lot. It's losing, and a floating point, yeah, floating point is better than the Alpha. So, but in the integer, the Alpha is actually a little bit worse than the x86, In floating point is better, the alpha architecture. Actually, instruction set when we talk like this. So it's really interesting comparison. So actually, x86 is not bad. Uh, the alpha is a little bit, let's say, a little bit worse actually, or at least the same. Uh, but the just the ARM is so good. That's the problem for x86. ARM instruction set is really good one, and this is not just this is not some ARM fun site or whatever. This is some really good study. You can find a link in the description, so you can actually go through. Like there is like a 50 pages PDF. It's really interesting. And there is also describing other problems for x86. There is some memory problems. It's maybe related to the 16 registers only, because ARM has a 31 registers. So it's a pretty nice comparison. So yeah, and this is only the IPC from the instruction set, and this is not the matrix multiplication. Matrix multiplication is another really problem for x86 and actually for the AMD. So you can see the ARM is really pushing the development really a lot. Okay, let's compare the architecture to x86. Also, not only like the execution units here. We already talked about the six LAUs and here, but yeah, this is one side of the equation. But what about the physical? Is it really huge? The architecture, like really in transistors count? So let's talk about it. Let's compare actually the dies, and this is gonna be really interesting. So let's compare the dies. Okay, check this out. Uh, this is Apple A12. This is the 2018 6 LAU Monster, and this is the first generation 811 Monsoon. But you can see it's really similar in terms of the integer core here. You can see that the integer core area is really big. It's like a 50-50 in compared to floating point unit. The same A12, it's really similar, but compared to the AMD Zen one, the LAUs are really small here. So you can see there is really missing a lot of logic in this area. And AMD is really good in floating point, so it's no surprise that the floating point unit is really taking big part of the CPU here. But it's actually it's not surprising that the LAUs here are actually taking a much less die size here. So it's not a surprise that Apple has a double IPC almost. Yeah, it comes from a lot of transistors, a lot of logic, obviously, and let's also compare, let's say the square millimeters, um, and this is the table from the with data I took from the NNTech site, and just take a look on the L1 instruction caches. L1 instruction cache, there is a comparison 128 kilobyte versus Zen 2 only 32 kilobytes. Even Zen 1 has a 64, but it was slower, so AMD moved to use faster but more L1 cache. It brought some pretty nice performance, why not? But Apple is using 4 times more It's a different architecture, but yeah, but it's another evidence that Apple monster IPC is coming from some monster architecture, also in terms of uh, size of the cache. And you can compare also the L2 cache. This is even bigger issue here. You can see there is an 8 megabyte shared cache for 2 cores, so it's a 4 megabytes per core, and one core can access 6 megabytes. So actually it's like a 12 times, it's like 12 times more than this half megabyte of Zen 2. If we look closer to the CPU architecture, you might also uh, argue that Intel architecture Core 2 Duo, the Merom architecture, was using also big L2 shared cache, but there was no L3. It was kind of substitution for the L3, and the Phenom from AMD was using also half megabyte L2 cache and using big 6 megabyte L3 cache shared among those 6 cores, right? So it's kind of interesting that Apple is using different kind of old cache architecture from kind of similar to Core 2 Duo with a huge L2 cache which is shared among the with the cores, and it's kind of interesting. And I expect actually with the A14 to have the 8-core chip will probably have a like 2 8 megabyte shared. Those 8 cores, they will be all like the quad core will share one 8 megabyte cluster each, I guess. And yeah, so I expect A14 to be really similar to this A13 setup actually. Let's take a look about let's take a look at L3 cache. L3 cache is really interesting here because Apple can use L3 cache also for GPU and neural processing unit here. So actually it's kind of shared, it's like a kind of system level cache, and Apple is calling it as a system level cache. And if we compare the to AMD, for example, the brand new AMD Renoir, which is great APU, and because it has a integrated Vega graphics, and but the GPU from AMD, it cannot use L3 cache from Zen 2. So actually, you can see Apple has an advantage almost in everything. You can see even the L3 cache is kind of shared for all the resources here. And you can just imagine that what you can do for Magic with those 16 megabytes. You can do a lot actually, because you can store their whole frame buffer. The double frame buffer could be stored in this 16 megabytes. So actually you can save a lot of power. You don't need to access every time you render your screen. You don't need to access to your memory, which costs some energy. So you can refresh your screen just running from this cache. I'm just guessing, but it's just might be working like this. And it's a mobile device, and energy savings is everything there. And it's interesting that AMD Renoir cannot do this. So it's but otherwise the big my desktop Zen is using also 32 megabytes per chiplet. Even it's internally it's divided into two CCXs with 16 megabytes each. So it's kind of so it's a 4 megabytes last level cache for each core. So you can see here it is like 4 megabytes for each core here, and in 8 core, if they will keep 8 megabytes per 4 cores, actually the Ryzen is better in terms of last level cache. If we consider that this L3 is similar to the Apple L2, and this is kind of extra. So it's kind of interesting, but Apple, you can see Apple is really monsters. Also in terms of caches, and a lot of features is there. It's really advanced, really advanced architecture. But let's compare also the die sizes. This is also really important, and this is probably the answer why actually Apple has a so huge advantage, because you can see here Apple has a 4.5 square millimeters die size, and it's actually 30% bigger than Zen 2, including L2 cache. It's fair to say that Apple is using high density process, and AMD is using low density high performance process to reach high frequencies, of course. And the difference at density is pretty huge actually. It's kind of 70% or something like this. And if we actually to compare, if you would like to compare the architecture, we need to somehow normalize and eliminate the different density. And if we do that, and if you use this different density and we recalculate the Zen core, we will like manufacture Zen 2 with a high density process, the same way like Apple is using. The Zen 2 core will have only 2.2 square millimeter. Is not bad, right? So not bad, but it's evident that Apple core, including L2 cache, is like 2.4 bigger than the Zen 2. So yeah, the monstrous IPC, it comes from really monstrous die size, and a lot of transistors is there. But the thing is that still it's not maybe fair, because we still like including those huge L2 cache, which is actually substituting like L3 cache on Zen 2 here. So what about to exclude and remove those L2 caches and use just the naked core without any L2 cache? Actually, we don't have the data is especially from Zen 2 is my estimation. Actually, this is not any data. I couldn't find anything regarding this, so this is just the estimation, because half megabyte usually is 0.2 0.3 square millimeter. So I applied the same thing and subtracting this number from the Zen 2 core, and we will end up 1.9 millimeter. And actually, for the Apple core, this is Anantech data, so we do have some data regarding this, and we can compare it. And this is really interesting. You know, it's the difference of the naked core is not that huge actually, but still is 40% more transistors. And assuming that actually the Apple ARM architecture is like a really low power, so there is more transistors, while actually being really efficient. And the most important is that they are providing 82 more IPC. And this ratio actually is the efficiency. Apple is able, with 40% or 37% more transistors, make 82% more IPC. And this is actually really important because a lot of people uh, they consider themselves as a CPU enthusiast, and they always talk about that there is no possible to scale IPC linearly with the transistors, that IPC always costs more transistors than actually it's increasing the IPC. So it's actually nonlinear. But here, with this Apple, you can see that Apple is able to really increase more IPC than the transistors. And this is the black magic actually and this is the actually the secret of efficient mobile design. They always need to increase more IPC than transistor count, because there is a less transistors, and it means you it means they actually increase the performance per transistor, and this comes only from architecture. And of course, when they move for better process node, it becomes even more multiplied. So that's why the incredible numbers is Apple A14 will be providing. So yeah, and the last line is also really nice to uh, because this is the die size without L2 cache, the naked one, but I call it the cost of a high speed. When we actually scale up using the low density, high performance process to be able to reach high frequencies. This is the cost of the high frequencies. When you need to go from 3 gigahertz or 3.5 gigahertz, you need to go to 4.5, 4.7 as Zen 2 is achieving. Your naked core will be 3 square millimeters. And in compared to Apple, which is still like a 2.61, you can see actually the Apple core, even is like a monster, there's a really a lot of transistors there, is actually 13% smaller. 13% smaller. And this is the secret sauce here. And this is the high price of high frequency. It costs you a lot of die area. It costs you a lot of power consumption, and it costs you a lot of problems when you're designing such a high speed.